Bantermole Cub, Stormchaser's Talent, and Gran-Gran have been banned in Standard. What does that mean for the format going forward, and what will the metagame look like? Let's find out. Hello and welcome to another Standard video. As you heard in the introduction, Standard just got a pretty big shakeup. I'm not here to discuss which cards should or should not have been banned, but instead I thought it would be a good idea to have a look at a bunch of different decks to see what the upcoming Standard metagame might look like. Now do keep in mind that the next big Standard rotation will take place in early 2027, about 6 months from now. So then Wilds of Eldraine, The Lost Caverns, MKM, Outlaws, The Big Score, Bloomburrow, and Duskmourn will all rotate out of Standard, which of course will have a huge impact on a lot of decks, and a lot of the decks I'm discussing today might lose a lot of important pieces as well. So when discussing the decks today, I'll make sure to highlight which cards are going to rotate out so you can make a more informed decision. Almost all of these decks will translate both in best of 1 as well as best of 3, with a few exceptions, which I'll also make sure to mention. Now, of course, we do have The Hobbit releasing today as well, but I do not think that set is going to have a huge impact on Standard, so most of these decks will remain unaffected. We might get 1 or 2 new archetypes, but for the most part, I don't expect The Hobbit to have a huge impact on the Standard metagame. So let's get started, kicking things off with Monowhite Auras, probably one of the most popular best of 1 decks in the format, and this is one of the few decks in the list today that is not going to translate particularly well into best of 3, since it doesn't have the most flexible sideboard plan, but it is a very powerful aggro deck, especially if you get to kick things off with the Optimistic Scavenger, rewarding you for playing additional enchantments with additional +1/+1 counters, and then you get to play some powerful auras like Ethereal Armor, as well as of course Sheltered by Ghosts, which is a main interaction that this deck has access to, and then you can also protect your creatures with those ward abilities. The Skyward Spider also has Ward 2 built in, and you even have a Shard Mage's Rescue that you can flash in for +1/+1 and hexproof until end of turn. So a very powerful aggro deck. The most important pieces will be rotating out of Standard in 6 months, since we'll lose a Scavenger and all the important auras from Duskmourn. So this is not a deck that's going to stick around forever, but for the time being it's a relatively cheap and powerful deck if you want to get into the format. Next up, we have the Superior Spider-Man Reanimator deck, and this is the exact same list I featured when Lorwyn first released. The game plan is very simple. We first want to fill our graveyard using all these discard and self-mill effects, and then at some point cast Superior Spider-Man and have it enter as a copy of Bringer of the Last Gift, and since we now cast it, we get to make each player sacrifice all their creatures and then return all other creatures from their graveyard back to the battlefield, which can potentially win the game on the spot if Terror of the Peaks is involved, as we can now damage the opponent directly, or maybe Arden, giving all our demons haste, can also allow us to attack for the win. So this is a very powerful combo deck that can potentially just win the game on turn 4. The deck also made a lot more consistent with the addition of Formidable Speaker as both a discard outlet as well as a way to find your Superior Spider-Man. Now this deck will lose some of its most important pieces, like Bringer of the Last Gift with the upcoming rotation, so hopefully it's only going to terrorize Standard for another 6 months. Next up, we have the Blue-White Synthesizer deck, which is another archetype that has been in Standard for quite some time. I even featured it recently with the additions of the Mind Stone to help you power out an early United Battlefront. All the permanents in this deck are pretty much mana value 3 or less, so you can find your Simulacrum Synthesizer and other artifacts, and this is the real centerpiece of the deck, helping you generate some huge construct tokens, which can help you close out a game, especially if you can then also give those tokens haste, if you can use your repurposing bay to maybe tutor up your one-off Fire Crystal to give all those tokens haste. So a very deadly deck that can also win the game pretty quickly, but tends to play a more controlling game with removal like Pinnacle Starcage, and then some spot removal like Perilous Snare or the Spring-Loaded Sawblades. So a very powerful strategy that will also lose most of its important pieces with the upcoming rotation, as a lot of the key artifacts are from the Lost Caverns of Ixalan, as well as from the Big Score, so this deck is not going to be around for too much longer. Next up, we have the Izzet Spellementals deck, which I would classify as a tempo control deck. you're going to spend the early turns casting a bunch of cantrips, filling your graveyard with lots of cheap instants and sorceries, and interacting with the opponent's creatures as well. And then at some point you can cheaply deploy your elementals. There's Hearth Elemental and Adimurk Crab, getting a discount for each instant and sorcery in your graveyard. The crab can also tap creatures down when it enters, can even play it at instant speed. And more importantly, these elementals will also help you discount your Sunderflock, which is a powerful finisher that will also send all of the opponent's creatures packing. And this used to be one of the best plays you can make in the face of a bunch of Bancher Mole Cubs, since bouncing all those Earthbended lands back to the opponent's hand will set them back on tempo a whole lot, and in the meantime you can usually get the game over with. So now without Bancher Mole Cub in the format, we'll have to wait and see if Izzet Spellementals is still going to have a big metagame share, or if it's also going to fade away. But with the upcoming rotation, it's also going to lose most of its key creatures, so then it's unlikely that we'll be able to replace them to keep the archetype alive. Next up we have the Blue-White Prison deck, which I featured on the channel very recently if you want to see some gameplay. This I would also classify as kind of a tempo control deck with more prison elements, thanks to cards like High Noon, which is one of the centerpieces, preventing players from casting more than one spell each turn. We can easily break that symmetry by flashing in creatures during the opponent's turn, some of them acting as counter spells, like the Aven Interrupter, plotting a card, and then there's Aang Swift Savior to airbend spells that are on the stack or creatures that are already on the battlefield. The airbending mechanic also works very nicely with Aven Interrupter, as those airbended cards will also get taxed for 2. And then the Sky Coach Conductor can flicker our creatures to re-enable their enter the battlefield abilities. In the meantime, Voice of Victory can maybe prevent the opponent from casting spells during our turn, same with the one of Jennifer Walters. So then our opponent cannot easily get around the High Noon restriction. So then before you know it, if all goes to plan, we can lock the opponent out of casting pretty much anything, while maybe drawing a bunch of extra cards with Enduring Curiosity. It's another very powerful deck. It will of course lose a lot of key pieces like High Noon and Aven Interrupter with the upcoming rotation, so it will have to adapt and maybe lose some of its prison elements and pivot more into kind of a blue-white flash deck instead. Next up is the Dimir Excruciator deck, which is another Superior Spider-Man Reanimator deck, but this, instead of being a pure combo deck, is more of a combo control deck with a combo finish of getting back a Doomsday Excruciator with Superior Spider-Man, and when this enters, because we cast it with Spider-Man, we'll still get both players down to 6 cards in their library, and then it's pretty easy to mill them out before we do by targeting our opponent with the Insatiable Avarice, or attacking with our Restless Reef, which can mill the opponent for 4 and then get the game over with pretty quickly. We still have Deceit as a powerful card to get back with Superior Spider-Man, because if we cast Spider-Man for double blue, double black, we get to choose both modes from Deceit when it enters the battlefield, so that's another powerful tool in various matchups. And then of course we get powerful instant speed removal that black has access to, as well as more discard with Duress to complement your Deceit. So overall a pretty powerful deck, although it will of course lose Doomsday Excruciator once Duskmorn rotates out of Standard, so then it may have to adapt, but the core of Deceit with Superior Spider-Man will still stick around, so it's possible that it can still continue on from there. Next up is Kona Combo, another feared combo deck capable of winning the game as early as turn 4 in the most popular build. So the goal is to get Kona, rescue Beastie on the battlefield, and then tap it down using our 8 different planets to enable its survival ability. So we have Uthros and Evendo, which can all be played earlier in the game, and then enable Kona to tap down on turn 4. So we can now cheat out whatever permanent we want, and of course we're going for Omniscience, which now allows us to cast whatever spells we want from our hand for free, which is easily going to set up some infinite loops, especially with the Northwind Avatar, allowing us to tutor up specific cards out of the sideboard, and then it's usually not too difficult to end the game from there, as a Jeskai Revelation can bounce the Avatar so we can recast it, tutor up another creature, can get a Shipwreck Dowser now, which can get back the Revelation. Revelation bounces the Dowser, and in the meantime, with each iteration of the loop, we get to make more Monk tokens, draw more cards, and more importantly also deal 4 damage to any target, so that can end the game on the spot. We can also start bouncing our own creatures with 3 main deck copies of River Regent and the one-off in the sideboard, which we can also find with the Northwind Avatar, so we now get to bounce our own creatures over and over, and if Roiling Dragonstorm is involved, we now also get get to draw through the entire deck until we find our Northwind avatar to close out the game. This deck also has some pretty good tools against control decks, with Lost in the Maze protecting your tapped creatures. So if you now play Kona and immediately tap it, it cannot easily be removed by instant speed removal. And then Cavern of Souls to make your Kona or maybe your dragons uncounterable, also makes counter spells ineffective. Although of course a lot of the popular control decks in Standard play Jeskai Revelation themselves, which can still bounce an uncounterable Kona back to hand for a turn, so that can buy them more time. But in general, a very powerful combo deck, also made more consistent by Formidable Speaker, finding Kona, or maybe one of your win conditions if you need those instead. Now Kona will rotate out of Standard in 6 months, so then the entire combo will fall apart and you'll need to find a different way to cheat Omniscience onto the battlefield. Next up we have Monogreen Landfall, which of course did get affected by losing Badger Mole Cub, but a lot of the core pieces will still be around for a long time to come. We can still speed up the deck if we start out with an early Llanowar Elves, and then two of the key creatures in my opinion are the Iyestill Explorer and Mightform Harmonizer, which are both from Edge of Eternities, so those aren't going anywhere. Iyestill letting us replay lands out of the graveyard while also playing an extra land each turn, especially powerful when combined with fetch lands like Escape Tunnel and more importantly Fabled Passage, which can enter untapped. And then the Harmonizer is one of the most powerful landfall payoffs in the deck, doubling a creature's power until end of turn. So if we can enable that a few times with Iyestill and a fetch land, we can very quickly close out the game out of nowhere. And then rounding out the deck, there's a few ways to configure it. You still have some extra threats like the Chocobo. The Mossborn Hydra doesn't always see main deck play, but especially if the format is low on interaction, the Hydra can very quickly run away with the game. Same with Tifa, which can also help you end the game. If we maybe pair it with a Planar Engineering, we could win the game on turn 4 or even turn 3 if we speed things up with the Llanowar Elves. And then there's other ways to search up extra lands with the Earthbender Ascension and the World Wagon. And we can also make the deck a bit more resilient to removal and control by including more copies of Esper Origins as something we can flash back if we mill it with Iyestill. And then of course a Sapling Nursery, a payoff for having lots of forests that can keep generating additional Tree Folk tokens, especially now that enchantment removal seems to be at an all-time low. Now this deck will lose some pieces with the upcoming rotation. One that I want to highlight is Fabled Passage, which as far as we know would be rotating out in 6 months, but the Hobbit did introduce a new fetch land that might enter untapped as long as you have an elf you can behold, so that might replace Fabled Passage once rotation happens. And to further highlight that you don't need Badger Mole Cub in the Landfall deck, a while ago I featured this blue-green version, which forgoes some of the earlier acceleration and creatures in favor of additional blue interaction and card draw, so the goal is still to close out the game with Iyestill and Harmonizer, maybe helped by additional +1 counters and trample from your Earthbender Ascension, but instead of having those earlier creatures, we have some counter spells like Spell Snare, which of course used to be important to counter opposing Badger Mole Cubs. I've now replaced 2 Spell Snares for 2 copies of Spell Pierce to help you out against some of the upcoming control decks, which will see more play. And then we still have some interaction here. The Spider Sense can also be useful against some of the Reanimator combo decks, and Quandrix Charm, another flexible counterspell that can also maybe pump up your own creature or destroy an enchantment. And then we get to blue card draw that we get to leverage with all the extra mana from Iyestill Explorer to help find your Harmonizer and help you close out the game. Still, of course, very important to have Fabled Passage here, so that's one of the key cards that we will lose with a rotation in 6 months. Next up we have Izzet Fling, which has had to adapt since losing Stormchaser's talent, so now it's a lot closer to a mono-red aggro deck. So we've got some prowess creatures in blue still with the Elusive Otter and the Drakecatcher, which also rewards us for hitting the opponent with a lot of power. And then Emberheart Challenger and the Slickshot Show-Off also reward us for casting non-creature spells to enhance their power or maybe trigger Valiant. So then the rest of the deck is a whole bunch of pump spells. Can also give Trample with Ancestral Anger or Dreadmaw's Ire, or give 3 additional power with Full Bore and Turn Inside Out at instant speed. Wild Ride at sorcery speed also gives our creature haste. And then we just have Secret Identity, which has the flexibility of being a pump spell or a way to give our creature hexproof in response to removal. And then hopefully we can get some big attacks in and finish off our opponent using the Burn Together adventure from Callous Sellsword to end the game on the spot. and we even have some mana fixing from starting town to occasionally cast a sellsword or use the adventure on the elusive otter. But this deck is just trying to be as fast as possible, maybe go underneath some of the turn 4 combo decks in the format, so it's not trying to be very subtle about it. It will of course lose a lot of its core creatures with the upcoming rotation, so it's not going to be around for too much longer, but if you enjoy this playstyle, there's plenty of similar decks you can play in Pioneer, for instance. Next up we have Abzan Lifegain, which is one of the many ways you can construct a Lifegain deck in Standard. So we want to deploy some early Lifegain enablers like Aunt May, The Case, Hinterland Sanctifier, and Virulent Emissary, which can then enable some of your Lifegain synergies. At 2 mana, we've got a whole bunch of creatures that pick up additional +1/+1 counters whenever you gain life. Leonardo also has built-in Lifelink, Tigra has built-in Trample and can be flashed in, Amalia lets you explore whenever you gain life, so that can also help you find additional land drops, whereas the Starscape Cleric can drain the opponent with every life gain trigger. And then at 3 mana, Halia can be a source of extra card advantage, whereas Moseo can get creatures back out of the graveyard. And then for additional card advantage, there's also the Lunar Convocation, which can also make additional bat tokens if you both gained and lost life, which is not too difficult to set up. So a very nice aggressive deck. It will lose some pieces with rotation, but it's possible that a life gain deck will still be functional afterwards. Next up is the Opus Storm deck, which is almost entirely made up of Secrets of Strixhaven cards. Featured this exact list on the channel a while ago, and yeah, this one will be around for a long time to come, of course taking full advantage of the Tablet of Discovery, which dodged the Banhammer, helping you make 2 mana for instants and sorceries, and then the core creatures that you're trying to leverage are the Molten Core Maestro and the Color Storm Stallion, both rewarding you for spending 5 or more mana on instant and sorcery spells. In the case of Stallion, making additional copies. In the case of Maestro, getting extra +1 counters and making additional red mana, which can also potentially lead to an infinite combo if you start looping together sorceress schemes to keep making more and more mana. And then you've got some nice curve toppers like Ashling's Command, which can also copy the Stallion if needed, and the Rapture's Moment to help you storm off and eventually close out the game by making a ton of Stallion tokens, or maybe just burning the opponent out with Traumatic Critique, or you can just keep looping back Burst Lightning with your sorcerer schemes and get the game over with that way as well. So very fun blue-red kind of combo control deck that will be around for a long time to come, just losing a few lands with rotation. And next up we have the Mardu Discard deck, which is an aggressive creature strategy that wants to be discarding cards from its own hand to enable various synergies, like growing its 1 mana creatures, Marauding Mako and Moonshadow. We also have some payoffs here at 2 mana with Cool but Rude, especially if we level it up. We can now deal 2 damage to each opponent whenever we discard a card. And then we also have some discard outlets with Iron Shield Elf gaining Indestructible and the Hardened Academic gaining a lifelink. And then these can also discard cards like Bloodghast, which we actively want in the graveyard so we can get it back with Landfall. And the Practiced Offense has also been a great addition to the archetype, as it's cheaper to flash back if we discard it first, as another way to enhance our team, maybe give a creature double strike, so that can represent a lot of damage very quickly as well. And then we still have room for a little bit of interaction, and you can pick your favorites between Erode, Burst Lightning, and Requiting Hex, depending on the meta. And most cards in this deck are from Aether Drift onwards, so it's not going to lose much outside of a few lands with the upcoming rotation. And then last but not least is 4-color control. Can also make it 5-color control or Jeskai control if you prefer, but the main distinguishing features are Tablet of Discovery to power out your expensive instants and sorceries. Stock Up is usually a 4-off as a powerful card draw effect, and then a Jeskai Revelation, which also dodged the Banhammer as both an answer and often the primary win condition in the deck, making a pair of Prowess Monk tokens, can deal damage, gain life, draw cards, kind of does it all. And then we can even flash it back with Flashback to do it all over again. This 4-color build is mainly splashing black for inevitable defeats as another flexible answer, and then we're also playing a one-off Northwind Avatar to gain access to a 15-card sideboard, even in best of 1, so we can maybe have an edge in the mirror match by grabbing an Ancient Vendetta to take away the opponent's Jeskai Revelations. Can also grab some graveyard hate like a Rest in Peace or Strategic Betrayal if you're facing a graveyard strategy, or Ultima if you're up against the Artifact deck, for instance, can also be quite backbreaking. So it's nice to have access to this sideboard with a Northwind Avatar, but it's not a must-have. You could also play Thor or maybe just another flashback if you don't want to bother with the Northwind Avatar. And then of course the deck has a nice mix of card draw with Stock Up and Consult, got a few counter spells with Negate and No More Lies, and then we can play a mix of removal. This one has Firebending Lesson, Abrade, Seer, Lightning Helix, and then Day of Judgment as our primary sweeper, with an additional copy in the sideboard in case we need to search it up. So a lot of ways to approach the deck. In the 4 and 5 color builds, of course, you're going to want Great Hall of the Biblioplex as additional mana fixing, and this can also double up as an extra win condition. So there's a lot of ways to build this deck. The core pieces are not going to rotate anytime soon, but you might have to swap some of the interaction and adjust the mana base slightly with rotation, but otherwise you will be able to play this strategy for a long time to come. Alright, so hopefully this gives you a better idea of what the upcoming standard metagame might look like, at least for the next 6 months. I'm still excited to build new decks with all the cards from the Hobbit expansion. Even if it may not have a huge impact on the format, you can expect to see those Hobbit cards featured on the channel starting tomorrow, and expect a lot of Brawl content as well. For now, if you're interested in any of the decks I featured here today, all the deck lists will be linked in the description as well. But for now, I want to thank you for watching, hope you enjoyed, and as always, have a nice day.